welcome to this lecture. And in this lecture, we will be considering an introduction to basic and applied human anatomy, of course, in line with the University of Zambia curriculum and syllabus, specifically for the School of Health Sciences. So let's get straight into this lecture. So for the objectives, these are the objectives of this lecture. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to explain how anatomy basically differs from physiology, and also you should be able to define what anatomy is. Apart from that, you should be able to describe the microscopic anatomy and its subdivisions. Uh, Fourth, um, should be able to define what gross anatomy is all about and also compare and contrast its subdisciplines. Also, by the end of this lecture, you should be able to clearly describe the anatomical directional terms, body planes, positions, movements, and axes. That basically, in a nutshell, you should be able to understand and know the anatomical nomenclature. Okay, so as a way of introduction, what is anatomy? So, by definition, anatomy is basically a science that deals with the structures of the body and the relationship between those between various parts of the body. So, in other words, what you're trying to say is that human anatomy studies the structures of the body, and if it focuses on a particular structure, it will also take into consideration how that very structure that is being studied is related to other structures and how other structures are related to that very structure. Okay, so uh, if you are considering um, the stomach, if you are studying the stomach, you take into consideration the relations when it comes to the stomach. Okay, you consider the relations of the stomach. That is what anatomy basically does. Okay, it does not only study a single structure, but it will also put into consideration um, the other structures that are related to that particular structure. So for the stomach, you also take into consideration the structures that are anterior to the stomach, the structures that are posterior to the stomach. Okay, so you should also take note that the word anatomy was basically derived from a Greek word the Greek word which is anatome. Okay, anatome, that Greek word basically simply means to cut apart. Okay, so was derived from a Greek word that simply means to cut apart. So the knowledge that you get to gain when it comes to you understanding these structures is very significant, because when you understand the structure, you also get to understand its functions in detail. So as one of the objectives in this lecture, that you should be able to differentiate between um, should be able to differentiate between physiology and anatomy. So physiology gets you in depth of how that particular structure basically functions, what mechanisms are involved when it comes to the carrying out of the functions regarding that particular structure, because anatomy only studies the structure, but now the function, yes, anatomy will know that okay, the function of this particular structure is ABCD, but now physiology will come in, what mechanisms bring about those functions named as ABCD. That is the difference between physiology and anatomy. So this slide is showing you the comparison of anatomy and physiology. So if we are to pick the first one here, if we are to pick this one, you'll see that in terms of anatomy, when we're talking about the muscles of the thigh, anatomy will tell you that the muscles of the thigh are composed of skeletal muscles, and they receive their innervation from somatic motor neurons. And now these muscles, they include the quadriceps and the hamstrings, which are designed to extend and flex the knee respectively. Now, when you come to physiology, physiology will tell you that the muscles of the thigh are able to voluntarily contract and provide enough power to move the parts of the lower limbs during a foot race, during a foot race rather. Okay, so that is how physiology and anatomy gets to differ. But it is very important to take note that anatomy and physiology cannot be uh, these two courses, or these two branches of science cannot be separated, because it's more like they depend on each other to properly function. Okay, so you must understand that anatomists or scientists who study anatomy, they get to examine the relationships among parts of the body, as well as the structure of individual organs. Okay, so you'll find that often the anatomy of a specific body part suggests what their functions. So that is why we are saying that the scientific discipline that studies the function of the body structures is what is known as physiology. Okay, so you find that a special relationship basically exists between anatomy and physiology, just as you have seen on this particular slide. Okay, so because a structure and its function cannot be completely separated, they so anatomy and physiology, they depend on each other. Now let's talk about the arrangement of various parts of the body. So various parts of the body may be arranged in two main types. Okay, so the arrangement can be in two main ways. Number one, the body part or the body may be arranged in what we call symmetrical arrangement. Symmetrical arrangement. So this symmetrical arrangement is where the arrangement of the body part on the right side and on the left side are similar. So for example, as you can see on this very slide, this illustration, you'll find that there is this line that is passing uh, vertically, okay, dividing the body into equal right and left halves. So you'll find that the limbs are the same, the eye equal, also the ears are equal, including the lungs, etc. Then we also have asymmetrical arrangement of the body. So asymmetrical arrangement, this is where now we are having two sides or halves that are not the same. So for example, here we have, this is the liver. So if the liver, if I am to cut here vertically, I am to cut like this, you discover to say that this part that is on your left, this side, and this part that is on your right, this side, they are not the same. Okay, so this kind of arrangement of the body part is what we call asymmetrical arrangement. So different body parts in the body um, can either be asymmetrically arranged or symmetrically arranged. Just depends with the body part. Now let's talk about the subdivisions of human anatomy. So human anatomy is basically divided into gross anatomy, you have microscopic anatomy, you have developmental anatomy. So these are the most uh, talked about arrangements of human anatomy, but in these notes I have included this other subdivision which I have just written as the specialized branches of anatomy. But most scholars and lecturers will focus on the will teach about the first three. Okay, let's start by talking about gross anatomy. Let's talk about gross anatomy. So gross anatomy is also known as macroscopic anatomy. Macroscopic anatomy, macroscopic from the word macro, which just simply means big. Okay, macro just means a bit big. All right. So this gross anatomy, which is also known as macroscopic anatomy, tends to investigate the structures and the relationships of large body parts. Okay, it's very important to take note that this has to do with large body parts that we are able to see with our unaided eye, with our naked eye. For instance, the large the intestines, you have the stomach, the brain, the heart, etc. You're able to see them without you were putting on maybe something that will help you to vividly see these body parts because they are big enough. Okay, so you discover to say that in these macroscopic investigations, it so happens that the preserved specimens or their parts are often cut open or dissected in order for them to be examined efficiently and effectively. Then for us to fully um, study anatomy in the gross uh, division, you need to understand that there are different approaches that you can use to study anatomy in the gross manner. So the first one, we have what we call regional anatomy. Okay, we have what we call regional anatomy. So in regional anatomy, this is where now regional anatomy gets to examine all the structures in a particular um, region of the body as one complete entity. Okay, so regional anatomy gets to study all the structures in one part of the body as one complete entity. For example, regional if you are studying anatomy, gross anatomy in a regional way or in a regional approach, you consider probably when you do the abdomen, you consider everything that is associated with the abdomen or everything that is found in the abdomen. And not just that, you can also study about the head and neck, where you will do everything that has to do with the head and neck, the nerves, the blood supply, and everything. Also, you can do the thorax. So if you are doing the thorax, you consider everything that is found in the thorax, starting with the um, starting with the bones, coming to the muscles. You consider the viscera and the like. Okay, then we also have systemic approach. Okay, we also have systemic approach. So this kind of approach, which is a gross anatomy of the body, which is it takes us to study gross anatomy. in a systemic way, you'll find that it examines both superficial anatomic, um, yeah, it studies the gross anatomy of each system rather in the body. Okay, so systemic anatomy gets to study the gross anatomy of each system in the body. For example, you'll find that if you are studying the urinary system, it would involve you to examine the kidneys where urine is formed, along with the organs of urine transport, and these include the ureters and the urethra. Okay, and not just that, you proceed as well to study about the storage of urine, which has to do with the urinary bladder. Okay, then we have surface anatomy. Okay, we have surface anatomy, the last approach to when it comes to gross anatomy. So this kind of approach basically studies internal structures as they relate to the overlaying skin. In other words, surface anatomy examines both superficial anatomic markings as well as the internal body structures as they relate to the skin that is covering them. Now let's talk about microscopic anatomy. Let's talk about microscopic anatomy. So microscopic anatomy gets to examine structures that cannot be seen by our naked eyes. Microscopic anatomy studies or examines structures that can't be seen by our naked eyes. Okay, so most of the time, scientists in this division of anatomy, they prepare individual cells or thin slices of some parts of the body and examine them using what we call a microscope. Okay, because their eyes cannot see. Okay, now microscopic anatomy mainly involves two components. Okay, microscopic anatomy mainly involves two components. We have cytology and we have histology. So when it comes to cytology, it is made up of two words which are coined together. We have cyto, which represents cell, then you have logi or logos, which means study. Okay, so cytology can also be known as cellular anatomy. So this cellular anatomy is just the study of single body cells and their internal structures. Okay, then we also have histology, which has to do with tissues. But to elaborate further when it comes to histology is that histology also is coined by two words. You have histos, which means web or tissue. Then we have logi or logos, which also means study. So um, this component of microscopic anatomy is the study of tissues. Okay, so histology takes more a wider approach to microscopic anatomy by examining how groups of specialized cells and their products basically function for a common purpose. Okay, then we have developmental anatomy. We have what we call developmental anatomy. Okay, so this developmental anatomy is also what we call embryology. Okay, is also what is known as embryology. So for embryology, this has to do with the study of developmental changes of the body. Okay, the study of developmental changes of the body. That is basically embryology. Okay, so in other words, when we're talking about embryology, this branch or this division of anatomy get to study the formation, development, and growth of an organism from the fertilized egg to the fetal stage, as it gets to explore the processes and stages that lead to the development of tissues, organs, and overall body structure, whereby it helps us understand normal development as well as congenital anomalies. Okay, so it is from this component of anatomy where you get to learn how the stages through which a human being passes through before even they are born. Okay, so you get to understand how certain congenital anomalies come about. Okay, how somebody might have hydrocephaly, how somebody might be born with spinal bifida, and the like, among other congenital anomalies. Okay, then we also have what we call specialized branches of anatomy. So these specialized branches of anatomy include, you have pathological anatomy, which has to do with the study of structural changes which are brought by as a result of diseases. Then you also have radiographic anatomy. This one is the study of internal structures which are visualized by X-rays. Then you have molecular biology. So molecular biology is just the study of anatomical structures at a subcellular level. Okay, then let's talk about the levels of organization in the human body. The levels of organization in the human body. So we need to understand that the simplest level of organization within the body is the chemical level that you are seeing here on this slide, is the chemical level. Okay, so this is the simplest, which is composed of atoms and molecules. Remember, atoms are the smallest units of matter. Then when it comes to molecules, molecules are just two or more atoms which combine together to form a molecule. For example, a protein, a water molecule, or a vitamin. Okay, so that is the first level of organization. Then the second level has to do with cellular level. Okay, so at the cellular level, you'll find that specialized structures, specialized structural and functional units are called organelles. So these organelles permit all living cells to share some common functions. Okay, and then you discover to say that large molecules get to join in specific ways to form what are known as cells. Okay, so these cells are what are considered to be basic units of structure and function in organisms. So we can therefore confidently say that the cell is the smallest structural unit that gets to exhibit the characteristics of living things, of which we're talking about organisms here, and it is the smallest living portion of the human body. Then the third level of organization is tissue level here. So this is tissue level. So you'll find that tissues by definition are just a group of similar cells with a common function. Okay, that is a tissue. Okay, that is what it means when we say that a tissue. Okay, so tissues are just groups of similar cells with a common function. Then tissues, it is of great importance that you understand and take note that tissues are precise organizations of similar cells that perform specialized functions. Okay. Then when we are talking about uh, still to elaborate further, when it comes to tissues, you need to understand that we have four main types of tissues in the human body, and you get to study all these four main types separately in histology. Okay, so we have what we call connective tissue. Okay, we have what we call connective tissue, and the connective tissue basically gets to protect, support, and it interconnects body parts and organs. Okay, connective tissue. And then you also have muscle tissue. So the muscle tissue is the one that is in charge of producing movement. And we have three types of muscle tissue. You have skeletal muscle, you have smooth muscle, and you have cardiac muscle. And not only that, the third type of tissue that you have is known as the nervous tissue. So the nervous tissue is the one that conducts impulses for internal communication. Okay, so we've mentioned three tissues. You have nervous tissue, you have muscle tissue, you have connective tissue, and lastly, you have what is known as epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue has to do with the covering of exposed surfaces and also gets to line up body cavities. Okay, so those are the types of tissues that you have as an individual. So we were on the third level of organization. So the fourth level of organization has to do with organ level. Okay, so at organ level, this is where now we have different tissue types coming together that work together to perform specific complex functions, forming an organ. Okay, then from an organ we have organ system. So for organ system, it consists of related organs that work together in order to coordinate activities and achieve a common function. So there are actually 11 organ systems in the body. Okay, there are 11 organ systems in the body. Then from after the organ system, the last level of organization is the organism. So you'll find that all body systems function interdependently. Okay, they function interdependently in a single living being, which is known as the organism. Okay, so that was it when it comes to levels of organization in the human body. Now let's start talking about basic anatomical terminologies. Okay, basic anatomical terminologies. We'll start with the anatomical position. We'll start with the anatomical position. So by description, the anatomical position is the standard reference. Okay, so this is the standard reference. Is the standard reference position of the body that is used to describe the location of structures. Why do we have the anatomical position? Why do we have the anatomical position? So it is very, very important that we get to understand why actually we have this anatomical position. So you need to understand that in order to avoid confusion when it comes to describing the body, it is always important and significant to describe it in the anatomical position. Okay, so you'll find that the anatomical position allows us to describe the body or the position of structures in relation to their surroundings. Okay, and not just that, the anatomical position also helps us to avoid confusion as to whether the body is lying down or the human body is standing up. Okay. And even as we proceed with talking about the anatomical position, you should also bear in mind that when looking at a person in the anatomical position, their right side will be on your left. Their right side will be on your left. Very, very important to take note of that. So the anatomical position is a standard reference position of the body that is used to describe the location of the structures, just like I've mentioned earlier. Okay, so this anatomical position is the standardized method of observing or imaging the body that allows us to make precise and consistent anatomical references. So this slide is just basically demonstrating the anatomical position. The slide is demonstrating the anatomical uh, position. So from this slide, we can say that you find that in the anatomical position, the subject is usually standing upright, and as they are standing upright, their feet will be together. Okay, just that here the feet are not, yeah, but we're able to see that the feet are together on this very slide. Okay, so the feet will be together, and when it comes, though the feet and though the toes are not showing here, but the toes should be pointing forward. And as you can see, the hands should be by the side with the fingers straight and together. Then the thumb should be at 90 degrees to the fingers. Okay, and not just that, when we focus on this other part, still in the anatomical position, you need to understand that the eyes should be focused at a distant object. Okay, the eyes should be focused at a distant object. That is what this blue arrow is trying um, to illustrate here, or to get our attention regarding this aspect. Okay, the eyes should be focused at a distant object, and the mouth should actually be closed, and the face should be neutral. Okay, the face should be neutral. Then the infraorbital margin, okay, the infraorbital margin, this one here, okay, the infraorbital margin here, that is the infraorbital margin, should be in the same horizontal plane as the external acoustic meatus, or external auditory meatus. So the external acoustic meatus is this uh, where my pointer is pointing right now, in the ear. Okay, that is the external auditory meatus. Okay, so hopefully that was clear. So away from the anatomical position, let's talk about the anatomical directional terms. Let's talk about the anatomical directional terms. So for the directional terms, we have superior and inferior, we have cranial and caudal, you have anterior and posterior, you have dorsal and ventral, you have proximal and distal, you have medial and lateral, you have deep and superficial. So these anatomical directional terms, the way they've been written here on this slide, that is how they're supposed to go. You cannot use superior and caudal. No, it don't make sense. So superior goes with inferior. If you are talking about cranial, then you can use caudal. Then for anterior, it is also front. Posterior, it is back. But you can't say anterior, back. No, it should be anterior, posterior, front, back. Just like that. Okay, so when it comes to superior, as you can see here, going towards the brain or the cranium, that is superior. Then going down here, that is inferior. Okay, so now when we are talking about these anatomical directional terms, when talking about these anatomical directional terms. It is very, very important to you have to familiarize yourself with these terms, okay? So you'll find that direction is usually used. So when the body is in anatomical position and we have to explain the location of a structure relative to structures surrounding it, we normally use these particular directional terms. And we also put into consideration the anatomical position. We don't forget that. So talking about superior. So for superior, if you want, you can use cranial. So superior refers to a structure being closer to the head or higher than another structure. In other words, superior refers to a structure that is being closer to the head or higher than another structure in the human body. Inferior. For example, we can say that the heart lies superior to the diaphragm. The heart lies superior to the diaphragm. Then inferior refers to a structure being closer to the feet or lower than another structure in the body. For example, you can say that the diaphragm lies inferior to the heart. Then we have anterior. Okay, we have anterior or ventral. Okay, anterior or ventral. So this particular term of anterior or ventral. So you're able to see these illustrations here. This first one is showing us the anterior aspect, then this other one is showing us the posterior aspect. Okay, so for the anterior part or ventral, this particular term is used to indicate the front of the body. Okay, the front of the body, or a structure being more in front than another structure in the body. For example, the sternum lies anterior to the heart. The sternum lies anterior to the heart. Then when we talk about posterior or dorsal, basically, this one just talks about a structure being towards the back of the body, that is behind. Okay, that is behind, basically. That is behind. Okay. For example, the heart lies posterior to the sternum. Then when we talk about medial, when we are talking about medial, um, as you can see, if we have, let me just use this this part, we are going to erase it after we finish using it. Okay, so let's just change. Okay, so let's say this is our midline. Okay, this is our midline. So this being our midline, you'll find that when we move towards this direction, it becomes medial. Okay, and then when we move away from the midline, it becomes what we call lateral. Okay, so towards the midline, it's medial. Away from the midline, that is lateral. So in other words, medial basically refers to a structure being closer to the midline or median plane of the body than another structure of the body. Then lateral, for example, um, uh, when it comes to medial, an example I can give you is that the heart lies medial to the lungs. Okay, the heart lies medial to the lungs. And then for lateral, it refers to a structure being further away from the midline than another structure. For example, the lungs lie lateral to the heart. Okay, then we have what we call distal. Okay, we have what we call distal. So for distal basically reference is to the extremities only. Okay, so reference is only made to the extremities. Okay, so we have the upper extremity and the lower extremities. So for distal basically refers to a structure being further away from the root of the limb than another structure. So when you're talking about the root, um, let's say the way this, um, because here this is a joint, glenohumeral joint here, and then you also have a joint here, which is the elbow joint. Okay, so you find that the bone that is here is known as the humerus. The bone that is here is known as the humerus. So this humerus, its root is considered to be here because this is where it is attached. Okay, the root is here. Okay, so the root is here. So you find that since the root, the reference, the root is here, if a structure or something is somewhere here compared to a structure that will be here. Okay, so let's say structure 1 is here and then structure 2 is here. You'll find that the structure that will be here, where I've put 1 here, this is structure 2. So the structure that will be on the part that will be on structure 1 will be considered to be proximal to the structure that will be at 2 because the root is here, which is closer to 1 than 2. Okay, so that is what we mean when we say root. So you find that distal refers to a structure being further away from the root of the limb than another structure. Okay, for example, the elbow is distal to the shoulder. Okay, just like what I was telling you, the elbow here is distal to the shoulder. So the shoulder is proximal to the elbow. Then we also have what we call superficial and deep. Superficial and deep. So for superficial, it refers to a structure that is being closer to the surface of the body than another structure. In other words, superficial has to do with towards the external surface of the body. For example, the sternum is superficial to the heart because the sternum is closer to the external surface of the body compared to the heart. Then for deep, it just talks about the structure being closer to the core of the body than another structure. For example, the heart is deep to the sternum. Okay, so these are just the directional terms of which we already talked about. Now let's talk about body positions. Let's talk about body positions. So when it comes to these body positions, it is very very important to also just get to familiarize um, yourself with these body positions. Okay, so we have various body positions. We have the supine position. So the supine position, this is where it refers to a horizontal position with the face and upper body facing up. Okay, that is supine position. Then for prone position is the opposite of supine position, where it also refers to the horizontal position, but the only difference is that the face and the upper body are facing down. Then we have what we call the lateral recumbent position. Okay, so this lateral recumbent position can be either left or right. So the word lateral simply means to the side. Okay, then recumbent simply means lying down. So this kind of position, it is a position where the individual is lying on their side. And most of the people, even when they are sleeping, they sleep in lateral recumbent position. Then we have what is known as the Fowler's position. We have what is known as the Fowler's position. So the Fowler's position, this in this kind of position, you'll find that the body is bent at the hips and the trunk is raised from lying to any angle up to 90 degrees. Then lastly but not the least, we have what we call Trendelenburg position. Trendelenburg position. So in this Trendelenburg position, this kind of position has the person in a supine position, okay? So involves supine position with the head about 90 degrees lower than the feet. So there's a slide here showing you the positions. So this is the prone position, then you have the supine position, you have the right lateral recumbent, then you have the left lateral recumbent, then this is Fowler's, and then this is Trendelenburg position. So that was it when it came to positions. Now let's talk about anatomical planes. Let's talk about basic body planes or basic anatomical planes. So these planes basically, um, these terms are used for planes or sections that cut the body or organs or tissues or cells. Okay, so these are the planes that we will talk about um, in the next few slides. You have frontal plane, you have the transverse plane, you have the parasagittal plane, you have the mid-sagittal plane, you have the oblique plane. Okay, so let's begin by talking about the sagittal plane. We'll start with the sagittal plane. We'll start with the sagittal plane. So the sagittal plane is um, this kind of plane basically is a vertical plane. Okay, so the sagittal plane is a vertical plane that passes through the center of the body, dividing the body into right and left portions. So the sagittal plane divides the body into right and left portions. Okay, then um, as you can see, this is the sagittal plane. Okay, this is the sagittal plane. It has even been labeled here, sagittal plane. So this sagittal plane is dividing the body into left and right. But now, if the division has divided the body into equal right and left halves, that sagittal plane is known as mid-sagittal or median sagittal plane. Okay, then if it just moves a bit from the mid sagittal plane, either to the left or to the right, a bit from the middle aspect, it will be known as parasagittal plane or paramedian plane. Okay, then we have the frontal plane. Okay, then we have the frontal plane. So for the frontal plane, it is also known as coronal plane. Okay, frontal plane is also known as coronal plane. So these planes, the coronal or frontal plane, are imaginary vertical planes at right angles to the sagittal plane. So the coronal plane is at right angles with the sagittal or to the sagittal plane. And this kind of plane, it cuts the body vertically. Okay, it cuts the body vertically into front and back portions. Okay, so the coronal plane cuts the body vertically into anterior, which is the front, and the posterior, which is the back portions. Then we have what we call the transverse plane. the transverse plane. So the transverse plane is also known as the axial plane, and it is also known as the horizontal plane. So these kind of planes, the axial or the horizontal, the transverse plane, are at right angles to both the sagittal plane and the coronal plane. And it is very important for you to note that the horizontal plane basically divides the body into upper and lower portions. Okay. Then we also have what we call an oblique plane. Okay, we have an oblique plane. So for this oblique plane basically passes through the body or organ at an oblique angle. So the oblique plane is not at 90 degrees to any angle, but it is passes at an oblique angle. So these are the body planes that we are from talking about. Okay. Now let's talk about the axis of rotation. The axis of rotation. Anatomically, the axis of rotation refer to imaginary lines around which specific movements of the body can occur. So number one on the list, we have what we call transverse axis. We have what we call transverse axis. So in transverse axis, you'll find that this axis runs horizontally from side to side and is perpendicular to the sagittal plane. And it is very important for you to note that the movements around this axis involve rotation and they occur in the transverse plane. So they involve rotation and the movements occur in the transverse plane. For example, this axis is the one that is involved in movements like rotation of the head from side to side when you are shaking your head in trying to say or to communicate an no as an answer. Okay, so that kind of movement when you are shaking your head to illustrate or to communicate no as an answer occurs in the transverse plane. Then we have longitudinal axis. We have longitudinal axis. So the longitudinal axis basically runs vertically from top to bottom and is perpendicular to the frontal plane. Now, the movements that occur in the longitudinal axis, they involve internal and external rotation, and they occur in the what? In the frontal plane. For example, this axis is involved in the movements like twisting of the torso. Thirdly, we also have what we call antero-posterior axis. Antero-posterior axis. So this axis runs from back to front, rather from front to back, and is perpendicular to the transverse plane. So movements around this kind of axis involve rotation and they occur in the sagittal plane. So for example, this axis is the one involved in movements like nodding the head up and down or shoulder abduction and adduction. Then lastly, we also have what we call diagonal or oblique axis. The concept of diagonal oblique axis in anatomy, it refers to an imaginary line around which a movement or rotation occurs in the body. Now, this axis, the diagonal or oblique axis, is not perpendicular to any of the three um, planes, that is the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, or the transverse plane, but it just occurs at an angle between them. Okay, so when it comes to human anatomy, movements around the diagonal or oblique axis can be observed in various joints. For example, the hip joint during walking or the shoulder joint during arm abduction. So I know you might be wondering, what is this abduction? Abduction. Don't worry, you understand as we proceed in this very lecture. Okay, now let's shift our attention to terminologies of movement. Let's shift our attention to terminologies of movement. We focus on terminologies of movement. So the first one we're going to talk about is flexion. We're going to talk about flexion. So flexion, we can simply put it as to bend a joint. Okay, so flexion has to do with the bending of a joint, and this is a movement that takes place in the sagittal plane. Okay, so flexion takes place in the sagittal plane, and it involves approximation of two parts of the joining bones. So when you are in the fetal position, when everyone is not yet born, when they are in the fetal position, they are usually flexing their joints. Then extension simply means straightening of the joint in the anatomical position. So when you are extending, when it comes to extension, a joint that was flexed basically gets straightened. Okay. Now, when you are standing in anatomical position, you discover that the joints are usually extended. In anatomical position, joints are usually extended. So this is a slide showing you uh, flexion. So flexion, you are reducing an angle, then extension, an angle is increasing. So in anatomical position, joints are extended, then in the fetal position, joints are flexed. Then we have what we call hyperextension. Hyperextension. So this one is a combination of two words. You have extension and you also have hyper. Okay. So hyper, which means too much or excess. Then extension, straightening a joint. So hyperextension has to do with the excessive extension of the parts at a joint beyond anatomical position. So this slide is showing you various movements. Okay, so you'll find that the best example we can use is let's use this one, which is at the bottom. Okay, so which involves the elbow. So you'll find that this elbow here, like this, because when this hand comes, when this arm moves in this direction, you'll find that flexion, elbow flexion is taking place. But now when it comes back like this and it reaches that zero here, that is the elbow extension. But instead of it reaching where there is a zero here, it goes beyond. Then that is what we consider as the hyper extension of the elbow. Then we also have what we call lateral flexion of the trunk. Lateral flexion of the trunk. As you can see on this slide, so lateral flexion is just the movement of the trunk in the coronal plane. By now you understand when we say coronal plane. So lateral flexion of the trunk is the movement of the trunk in the coronal plane. Then now let's talk about adduction. So adduction is the movement of the limb, the movement of the limbs, okay, towards the body in the coronal plane, towards the body in the coronal plane. So it can either be the upper limbs that are taking place in the adduction, or it can be the lower limbs. So if the lower limbs are moving, if they are moving in this direction towards the midline, that is adduction. But if they are moving away like this, then it becomes abduction. Okay, so abduction is the movement of the limb away from the what? From the midline, still in the coronal plane. So this slide is showing you uh, hip joint. So this is it of the hip joint. It has to do with the hip joint. So abduction of the hip joint away from the midline, adduction of the hip joint towards the midline. Then for the shoulder joint, abduction away from midline, adduction towards midline. Then this is also abduction of the thumb and the abduction of the thumb. Then we also have what we call circumduction. We also have what we call circumduction. So circumduction is just the combination in the sequence of movements which involves the flexion, extension, abduction, adduction accordingly. Okay, this is the circumduction. Then we have what we call rotation. So rotation, remember we talked about axis of rotation. Yeah, so rotation refers to movement of a part of the body around its own axis. It can be in the longitudinal axis, in the vertical axis, etc. Then we have what we call medial rotation. So medial rotation, this is the type of movement that results in the anterior surface, okay, the anterior surface of the part facing medially towards the midline. Okay, so medially towards the midline. Then we have lateral rotation. We have what we call lateral rotation. So lateral rotation is the opposite of medial rotation in the sense that this lateral rotation is the movement that results in the anterior surface of the part facing laterally away from the midline. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. So this is external rotation, this is internal rotation. Then we have what we can classify as the special movements. Special movements. So among the special movements, we have what we call pronation. Okay, pronation. So pronation has to do with rotation of the forearm. So when you rotate the forearm, let me show you the forearm. So this is the forearm. Okay, so this is the forearm here that you are seeing. Okay, so pronation involves the rotation of the forearm so that the palmar surface, the palm, okay, the palmar surface, that is the palm, so that the palmar surface gets to face downwards or backwards. That is the pronation. Then we have what we call supination. So supination is involves rotation of the forearm so that the palmar surface is now facing upwards or anteriorly. So this is what we are talking about. Okay, so supination, pronation, supination, pronation. Then we have what we call inversion. Inversion. So inversion is the movement of the sole of the foot. Okay, is the movement of the sole of the foot inwards, that is medially, so that the soles of the feet face each other. Then we have what we call eversion. So eversion is the movement of the sole of the foot outward, that is laterally, okay, so that the soles of the feet face away from each other. So this is what we are talking about. So this is invasion, this is evasion. Invasion, evasion. Then we also have what we call dorsiflexion. What we call dorsiflexion. So dorsiflexion involves bending the foot in the direction of the dorsum. Okay, it involves bending your foot into the direction of the dorsum. Then plantar flexion. Plantar flexion has to do with the bending of the foot in the direction of the plantar surface. This is what I'm talking about. Okay. Remember, flexion reduces the angle. Okay, flexion reduces the angle. So when we talk about dorsiflexion, this is the dorsum. Okay, so dorsum and the flexion. So we are trying to reduce the angle of the dorsum. So the dorsum is this top part. Okay, the dorsum is that top part. So we are trying to reduce the angle of the top part. Then when it comes to plantar flexion, you'll find that this part gets straightened. The angle is increased on the dorsum part, but the plantar, the angle of the plantar is the one that gets reduced now. That is plantar flexion. Then we also have what we call protraction. You need to know these terms. Protraction. So protraction is just the movement of the mandible or shoulder girdle forward on a plane parallel to the ground. Then the opposite of protraction is retraction. To retract, to remove, more like to remove. Okay. So retraction rather is the movement of a protracted part of the body backward on a plane parallel to the ground. So these are what we're talking about. So protraction, retraction. When it comes to the mandible, you're able to see there's a difference here. Retraction moving back, protraction, the mandible moves it forward like that. Then we have elevation. So elevation is the upward movement of a part of the body, e.g., or for example, you tend to elevate the mandible when you close your mouth. Then depression is a downward movement of the part of the body, that is, you depress the mandible when you open your mouth. See from this slide, okay? This is illustration. So elevation like that, depression like that. Now, when we consider movements of the wrist, we have what we call radial deviation. So radial deviation is just the movement of the wrist towards the radius or the lateral side. So radial deviation is when you are moving, remember the anatomical position, don't forget. So radial deviation has to do with you moving the wrist towards the lateral side. Then we have ulnar deviation. So ulnar deviation is the movement of the wrist uh, towards the ulnar or the medial side. Okay, as you can see here. So this side, this is when you're moving in this direction, this is radial deviation. This side is ulnar deviation. Then we have what we call opposition. So opposition is the movement of the thumb across the palm of the hand. So opposition is one of the key kind of movements that only humans are able to make, which distinguishes it from monkeys, because monkeys cannot even hold a pen. Okay, so these are just the additional illustrations to show you what we are talking about. This is where we end in this lecture. Thank you very much.